So welcome, everybody, and thank you to the Battle of Ideas. I'm Alka Cuthbert. I am Chair or Director at Don't Divide Us. This session is really about what it says on the tin. Race Equality Act. Will it include race relations or will it not? Labour have been relatively quiet about it, but it's kind of there, lurking in the background, and I'm hoping at least one of our speakers will give us elucidate a few more details. So now, to help us in our conversation with this session in hand, we have four excellent speakers who I'll introduce briefly. Their longer biographies are on the website, and do check now. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak, and then I'm going to come straight out to the audience. So first up on my violet is Albie Amankona, who is a broadcaster, financial analyst, vice chair of outreach, LGBT and conservatives. Is that right? Is that the
LGBT plus conservatives?
okay.
Call this.
A bit. And co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism. Then second, after Albie, will be Colin Wynter, who is a multi-award-winning barrister at Marion Wynter Chambers. I've got images of Oscars here for barristers. And a keen observer of how language is manipulated in public debates over controversial issues. Then further, we will have, on my immediate right, is Hardeep Singh, who is journalist, author of the recent Civitas report, Islamophobia Revisited, and the original one, this is the Islamophobia Bash, and deputy director of the network of Sikh organisations. And then last but not least is Anna Loutfi, also a barrister at the Barrister Group and managing partner of DL Law, and a member of Don't Divide Us Advisory Board. So let's just get stuck in, and Albie, you've got each one will have 5 to 6 minutes to speak. Go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for coming. So Labour's landmark race equality act, what they propose, is aiming to enshrine equal pay for Black, Asian and other ethnic minorities and strengthen protections against Jew discrimination and other racial inequalities. Sounds like a noble goal, because after all, who isn't Labour but equality under law and equality of opportunity? But this proposal might lead somebody to think that employers are currently free to pay people differently based on their ethnicity, or that there's a significant legislative gap in UK anti-discrimination laws. And the simple fact of the matter is, no such gaps exist. And this is something which most would agree on. I spoke to experts on both the left and the right. But today some people will disagree with me, but a lot of them that I speak to say that no such legislative gap exists. And whilst race might be a key factor in some disparities, let's take health outcomes, quite a well-cited example is the disparity that we see in maternal mortality rates between white mothers and non-white mothers, or the very well-documented disparity in the criminal justice system. It does explain disparities in all areas. If we look at education outcomes, some ethnic minority groups, like the British Indian cohort or the British Chinese cohort, actually outperform the white British cohort, which is of course the white majority cohort. And that actually, within racial groups, we can see very big disparities in outcomes. If we take the Black African community, they tend to have a lot better outcomes than the Black Caribbean community, which would suggest that perhaps race alone isn't always the key factor when it comes to life outcomes. But all of that being said, a lot of conservatives can make unhelpful statements like, Britain is the best place in the world to be an ethnic minority, without actually accepting that things could and should be better. And so that underpinned, I suppose, the government's response to the BLM protest back in 2020. There was the inclusive strategy laws launched by Boris Johnson, taken up by then Equalities Minister, hopefully the next door leader, Kemi Badenoch. And then in response to that, Labour come up with their Race Equality Act. I think it's notable that George Floyd's murder thousands of miles away created a bigger conversation about race relations in the UK than the recent violence did. And I think we need to take calls to think about why that happened. Personally, I think we need to be more proactive when it comes to the conversation about race relations here. And so I suppose you'd argue this is some proactivity, but I personally think it's wrong. I think probably the best example of proactivity in the race relations discussion in the UK recently was Theresa May's race disparity audit, which was, I think it's back in 2018. But it wasn't fully built upon the political turbulence that happened after Theresa May. And I think all of that probably better off forgotten. So we have all of this data on race relations, but what are we doing with it? Too often, it's just left geeky people on panels like me to discuss it with audiences who are interested, like yourselves. But I think we need to take the conversation out of Westminster, and we need to broaden the conversation to all four corners of the United Kingdom. I don't claim to have all the answers on improving race relations, but I do know that we're not making the most of forums that bring together policymakers, experts, community leaders, and the general public. And I think forums like this are really powerful opportunities for progress. So instead of a sweeping Race Equality Act to solve race relations in the UK once and for all, I would propose a simpler, non-legislative solution. And a solution that I think would actually be more effective. An annual national forum on race relations, a similar concept to the ill-fated LGBT conference, a Say to Be Me conference that the Boris Johnson Tory government proposed. I think it was meant to take place in 2022, but that didn't happen for reasons that I'm not necessarily unhappy about. But I would propose that this conference on race relations could take place around the time of the anniversary of the landing of the Empire Windrush. It could bring together government organisations, non-government organisations, policymakers, expert and community leaders that could participate in open discussions with Q&A sessions that could help the audience and the public participate in these important conversations. Crucially, I think this forum would need to be inclusive of the struggles of white working class people as much as ethnic minorities, because we know that disparities aren't necessarily limited to race. It's an evidence-based, inclusive approach to race relations that focuses on the most important part of diversity, which in my opinion is diversity of opinion. And I think this is how we can make real progress on race relations in Britain. An annual forum, having conversations involving the general public, involving experts, coming up with ways to improve race relations and community cohesion in Britain without the need for more legislation on top of legislation that actually sorts out a lot of the problems that this Race Equality Act claims that it wants to solve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and well within time. Excellent. So we'll give everyone a huge round at the end. Let's push on with, next up, Colin.
Well, let's start by saying I started my career at the bar before there was a thing called diversity. There was nothing. We barely had, I think, 6 or 7 years at the Race Relations Act, which had no discrimination. So those were times when you had to rely upon ability, merit, and the goodwill of those people who might give them a chance. So I call it the Wild West days. And I've watched over the past 40 years, there's this move, a position where my race was an impediment, to position now, too late for me, where I could use my race as an advantage. And both to me are equally wrong. Now, you probably were wondering, as I did, and I did until last night, what is this Race Equality Act all about? Where is it? Where's the draft legislation? What does it look like? What are you trying to do with it? So next, I decided to have a look, and what I found was very interesting. There's not much in the Lake Party. There's the manifesto, and I never looked at it before last night, and it went plowing through page after page after page, so I got to the end of this, and it says, not a loss, but it's tell us this. Sorry, to the very end. It says, Labour will introduce a landmark Race Equality Act to enshrine law full rights, equal pay for black, Asian and other ethnic peoples. One small mercy there, at least we're not called beige. Whiskey of black and minority ethnic. Now, I don't know about it, but to me, the most offensive part of that is the turning of an adjective to now an adjective, turning on it oaks. That beige, let's say, unaffected people, strengthen section against dual discrimination and root out other racial inequalities. And said a bit more about we will introduce the full right to equal pay. For the sake of we all can float that. That's a easily defined route that deserves equal treatment. Building on gender pay gap, of course, you do issue disability and ethnicity pay gap for the large employers. There's large employers, not small ones. Now, large employers that we all know operate pay grades, case gains. So you're going to take a say within some small crowd that does the same work as somebody else. This is aimed at something entirely different. And we know that from documents, the TUC documents, and it may be going to what follows that this, but says this. An ethnicity pay gap is a measure of the difference between ethnic groups, Aborigines, regardless of role or seniority. So you have built in there this discrepancy will sort of automatically have a gap at the pay gap that must be filled. How do you fill it? How do you fill it? You appoint somebody, you recruit people on high salary who are black or Asian or as a minority in order to fill that gap and narrow that ethnic pay gap. And what you do is you can go to the Davos or you go to all the world level forum places and say, look what we've done, we have no ethnic pay gap. Meanwhile, you restore somebody who may be embarrassed to have the job, maybe they're happy, and you build resentment in the workplace for those who think, why is that chap or that woman a job? Why is Colin Wynter being made £250,000 a year head of diversity? I think I know why that happened. They wanted to narrow that ethnic pay gap. I've been shown the yellow card, which means I have 2 minutes. It's like within 2 minutes. But that's the TUC guide. And I don't know whether going to say that this, but the real problem I see is when I just put that a landscape. It's you start out with gaps, and people by the time these are being discussed, can be asking, what's it mean the ethnic pay gap? It should mean for people who are same job that pay different money, alike variables of seniority and thicker scales. But that's not necessarily. I very much doubt that what they're here. They're looking at using equity. We all know where that comes from. Equity, easy eye, equity part. To narrow gaps of outcome rather than ability or achievements.
Thank you so much. Again, very, very disciplined speakers. Thank you for getting some very interesting things about the career. Next up, Hardeep.
Thank you. This is all very well-meaning by Labour who like to see themselves as chapter in diversity. However, I've been asked to the question, I think this is necessarily a support community petition, allowed anybody beyond the existing legal framework. So I'm agreeing with the previous speakers. However, I think it might exacerbate identity politics, and that can lead to more division, sadly. So improving race relations, I believe, quite more of a holistic approach. You can look at education disparities, social segregation, integration, and look at the role of the family. And the phenomenology, also differences between cultures. And we get from the Kemi Banor got herself in a bit of hot water about by basically when she said modern culture to equal. I've been the victim of this. I mean, I know what it's like, as many of you probably do. I remember getting on a bus in London many years ago and ordering my fare, and a charming gentleman standing behind me said, Raghead's got more of a Cockney accent than I have. And around the same kind of time, when I was at university, I was assaulted by extremists and now prescribed Hizb-ut-Tahrir. There's one particular zealot used to shoulder barge every time he saw me on canvas. He only stopped when he received a splendid counterbarge from Monacolia. However, I mean, I think when my father grew up at that time, that racism was like it's South riots, 1979, time of the National Front. But if we look at things now, they differ. The BNP aren't believing council or elections seats or European Parliament seats, and I've never dreamed that a fellow Punjabi would be the Prime Minister of this country. But we find ourselves in this great position now where people asking the question, milk racist, or see countryside a racist and colonialist white space. Now, the Sunday disorder has opened a lot of people's eyes in terms of the fragility of society. This piece of legislation does not frankly deal with complex reasons that trigger views of marginalisation among some sections of society, and they feel left behind. I mean, Sama, who gave the, I'd say, miscalculated need to BLM, was very quick to dismiss all the Southport protesters as far right. Yes, there were some far right people, but not all were. And there still appears to be very little at this time of the government to look at reasons why we had that flare-up of violence across the country. And the proposed legislation on that disability payouts doesn't really kind of tell us what we need to do. I agree for disability, that's much more clear-cut and important. However, I think with ethnicity, there's variation across different ethnic groups, and that we should automatically assume it's really down to discrimination. One thing's almost said, so when I say this to two lawyers on the panel, that the e-legislation would like to bolster the well-upholstered trouser pockets of lawyers, given what we've really seen in the case with ASA, and as one politician puts it, the legislation will be a bonanza for dodging activist lawyers. Lord Sewell's report for the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities points to a statistical challenge when it comes to looking at ethnicity pay gaps. I mean, we're all kind of aware of that. And I think one of the other speakers touched on this. The Labour Forces Survey demonstrated for Indian and Chinese men and British Black African men, as well as white men. Other groups noticeably less, so Pakistani and Bangladeshi men, particularly those born outside of the UK, earn less. But until we kind of get to the root cause of this disparity and look beyond discrimination, we're not going to move any further forwards. But for me, the starting point to all this is what qualified as an ethnicity. What is an ethnic minority? According to the census, there's 19 different ethnic groups. In London, there's over 100. I'll put a yellow card. I'll be very quick. And we've got these terms like baying that are floating around. I totally agree that, Colin, that's the catching term, which is actually quite insulting. And it never often covers white gypsies or travellers or Jews. You often don't think of them, and you think of the word babe or B&E. One of the other things I see coming on the horizon, which I'm quite simple, to be honest, is that some religions perceive themselves to be ethnicities or racial groups, and that's going to have serious consequences for this legislation. Take my community. There was a campaign by a pro-Khalistan group who suggested that Sikhs are an ethnic group. They should be recorded as such in the census. Now, unfortunately, the NS didn't do that, but still, there's people in my community who believe that Sikhs are an ethnic group and they should be recorded as such. And I've probably got 1 minute left, so I'm going to be very brief. My personal view is that we don't need a new law that perpetuates a racialised view of society. We've got the necessary protections in the existing legal framework, and to improve those relations, we need to start off with education which starts at home. We've got to look at our commonalities. We've got to look at how we're bringing up our children, because ultimately, the family is the testing ground for the real world.
Like you said, Barbara.
So Lydia, some really important things coming out here. We've got the idea that Albie introduced that, that we might be against the Raise Equality Act, but does that mean there's no room for improvement in our society? What might that improvement be? Where might it come from? Which are things that both Colin and Hardeep have looked at in different ways: education, the family, apply to disability, which seems a clearer category than race. But anyway, just to keep those in your head while we come to our final speaker, last but not least, Cuthbert.
Thanks, Alka. And thanks for having me. A vodka and tonic to anyone in the room who can guess my ethnic minority say. So I'd be very interested for thought. I'm going to respond to the topic today with some questions, reflections, really. I haven't got any answers, so just questions. Colin has just spread out the relative passage from the Labour Party Manifesto. Labour is landmark Race Equality Act enshrining and daughter full right to pay for Black, Asian and other ethnic minority people, blah, blah, blah. We are not told in this manifesto, if I know documents anywhere else, which might insist, I haven't seen the Cody document Colin put it, but we're not really told what is meant by equal pay. There's no reference in this manifesto to equal work, although it's inferred that equal pay for equal work is packaged within offered. But more significantly, and Hardeep just touched on this, we have provided with nothing to help us to understand what is meant by the phrase Black, Asian and other ethnic minority people. We haven't written the expression on what legally is being proposed by the government, not benefiting IFA, and for who. We've been given no data, no research, qualitative or quantitative, with no problems that we are told that this proposal will seek to address. We're not told what ethnic pay gap reporting for large employers is, how it's carried out. We're not only told what is a large employer. Now, Annalise Dodds, in a Guardian article earlier this year, stated, "It's never been more important to deliver race equality. Inequality has soared under the Tories, and too many black racial and minority families are working harder and harder for less and less." Well, on what researches has Staber based that race inequality has soared? Does she mean that all black, all Asian, and all ethnic minority families are working harder and harder for less and less? Because of race, and against which categories she's speaking, are non-black, non-Asian, ethnic majorities, whatever that means, not working harder and harder for less and less? And is that nothing to do with their ways? How are economic conditions explained by race? And it's significant, I said, that government has wholly ignored Toyi Sewell's March 2021 report with the Commission on Race and Habit Disparities, in which she points out the really rather A-level basic difference between disparity and discrimination, and the significant statistical and data issues that arise where you clumsily substitute the binary characteristic of male and female with the complex, multifaceted characteristic of ethnicity, lumping whole swathes of the population into minority groupings for no other reason than to virtue signal and falsely apologise for the existence of the British Empire. Now, I remember back in the day that when we were told that we were going to vote on Brexit, one of the arguments was that we needed immigrants because British people won't do certain jobs. The jobs that they were talking about were low-paid jobs, fruit pickers, auxiliaries in the NHS, cleaners, nurses. So is the Labour Party seeking to challenge the paradox that people will come to the United Kingdom to do low-paid work that the natives won't do when they propose this race equality? Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, because actually what we are dealing with in reality is a globalised labour market where low pay is an incentive to people to foreign countries. And that was acknowledged universally on the left as an argument for Remain. So I would ask, Nick, I'd invite your thoughts on whether or not actually Labour is now seeking to matebise the labour market as opposed to mobilise. And as a time already, I will just say very briefly in closing that the Equality Act as it stands does prohibit racial discrimination at law. So it is a massive question what it is that these proposals seek to ask. But I would also go back to the point again that Hardeep made about definitions. Definitions are all in law. What is black? What is Asian? What is an ethnic minority? Are Chinese, Koreans, Brazilians, Portuguese, Spanish, Welsh, Macedonians, Ukrainians, Jamaicans, Nigerians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Bangladeshis, in whatever combination you can imagine, to be plonked on the side of a binary named ethnic minority against an ill-defined category of ethnic majority, which, by the way, if we mean white British, are now a minority in this very city. There are other issues as well, which I'm having to talk about in the discussion, but the main one, as I close, is what is meant by equal work. We know at law that it no longer means identical jobs. It means similar or equal in value. So I invite you to think about this as my conclusion. Is race not here an elephant in the room? Actually, that's the wrong phrase. Is it not a massive distraction? This is not about race. This is about encouraging a view of the labour market which is completely divorced from the realities of the business and the economic world, and encouraging us to think about employment as something that is increasingly controlled and centralised by the state, where wages are increasingly uniform and competition is increasingly reduced as an option for entrepreneurial, independent economic actors in this country. It is, in other words, socialism by back door, and race is the weapon that's being mobilised to introduce it in the name of kindness and apologies for past historic wrongs. Thank you. That's good.
want to thank our speakers for their fantastic contributions. Both Anna and Colin for having read the Act so that we don't need to, the directors. But actually, I would suggest we do try and read it to find out more about it. I found the looseness thing very, very interesting because it seems to have very important democratic implications for democracy and democratic governance and procedure within institutions. Because if it's so loose, it leaves it so open from pressures like the TUC and a whole set of other campaigners to then kind of fill in the substance of the Act in ways that could circumvent what we would hope to be democratic processes. But anyway, that's enough from me. Over to you. Could I see hands up, please? And I will take them the batches.
Just the only comments that Anna made then, I suppose socialism by factor. So the basis of our society was capitalism. And capitalism was all about exploitation. So you'd exploit your workers in order to create profit. That was the whole basis of Western civilization. And that brings into play concepts about discrimination because, of course, a factory worker who could pay that person less than that person would make more profit. And the idea was, if that factory over there could make more profit perhaps by paying them more, and they would be happier, more productive workers, then capitalism would say that factory wins. But if in reality this factory here made more profit by exploiting, then that factory would succeed over this one. So there was a dynamic, competitive market, as Anna says. So my point is, just picking up from Anna, should we not have exploitation rather than equality?
Hello. I think I'll become increasingly cynical, but the more people talk about race, the more I feel like it just exacerbates the divisions. And I'm ready to stop talking about it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. It just seems like every conversation about race opens the door to grievance culture and allows people to hijack the conversation for their own agenda without actually improving anything, and with also kind of misrepresenting data and what's actually going on. So I'd like to stop talking about it, but I'd love to hear what you think about it now.
I see that you used the word socials, left as pejoratives. I am Marxist, a Bellite, a Brexiteer, and a Leveller. These people who call themselves socialists, elect, are like many Buffix Nicholson. They are not. They are elitist tyrants who indulge in identity politics at the expense of the very people they are supposed to support and represent. All of you touched on it. The problem is class, education, disparity in prosperity is why I went to health service. I was married to a woman of mixed race from abroad, was invited over to work in a health service, invited, and they tend to gravitate to the low jobs. Geriatric union, public transport. This is all about prosperity, the lack of prosperity, and that's being used as a model form of people trafficking and slavery by the very people who say we apologise for it. So it's decent pay, decent conditions for all the working people, a proper education, not indoctrination. And we might find a lot of our problems just disappear.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very common issue that comes up in these discussions, caste versus race. But I would say one thing to consider is a bindage from the recent British Social Attitude Survey, which says that a lot of people still do identify as working class, because there was a thesis a while ago that caste is Spanish, new types of background for Blair years. But no, people do still identify as working class, but it's never been less related to their work. It's far more related to education and their consumption power. So anyway, not doing anything with that, just throwing it out there. But we go to our last speaker for this session, and he's really round a bit often, but out here.
I thought the speakers are going to talk about race relations, so they seem to be talking about whether there's racial equality.
So that was quite surprising to me, because it does seem to me that the legislative
several people seem to be approaching this from a legalistic background. If we look at the 2010 Equality Act, has that improved race relations in the UK? I don't see that it has. I think that, if anything, it seems to have divided and made a more fractious relationship between. So I think if we take a step back from the sort of legalistic aspects, in terms of race relations, this is not going to improve race relations. If we see things have been re-racialized and have tended to disintegrate over the past few years. So I'd like to speak maybe to reflect on that. The other thing is, if you look at racial divisions that there are in society, this legislation could never address them. I remember once I got a bus about 5:30 in the morning across London, and I went from Elephant and Castle into town, and the main people on the bus with me were black women. I was there to clean the office. Then I got onto the Jubilee line, and as I was going out to the city or the Jubilee line, the people on there were mainly white Eastern European workers going to work on building sites at East London as you go out of it. And then as I was going along the DLR, starting to come into the station, were mainly young white professional women going into the Canary Wharf. There's a racialised provision in the labour market. None of this addresses that. There are divisions along class, and they sometimes connect on ethnic line. But in terms of race relations, this does nothing to, if anything, deteriorate social behaviour.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, that to be fair to the lawyers on our panel, that kind of what the decision about the act. We are the session that I'm speaking at next on the Equality Act, particularly, and how it intersects with freedom. Very good point. I would just like to kind of got the panel to comment on anything that we've so far. But it is interesting, isn't it? Because if we all, there seems to be sort of agreement that the Race Equality Act is not. There are, or there may be real problems, whether they're class or race or intersectional. But this act isn't addressing them. So then it's worth asking, well, what is this act for? What is it trying to, what are the people proposing it trying to do, if not address real problems? What kind of things are they trying to address? Or is it just a kind of complete random fantasy of the Labour Party? Anyway.
One thing I forgot to say, and it's what Alka just said about what is this act for, which reminds me to say this. I found out what there was a ONS, Office for National Statistics, details of earnings. 2019, so it's 4 or 5 years ago, 2019, this is the measure of the problem that is said to warrant a Race Equality Act. In 2019, the median hourly pay for those in the white ethnic group was £12.40 per hour, compared with those in the ethnic minority at, guess, £10, £8, £7? No, £12.11 per hour. The difference was 29 pence an hour. Now, when you take into account that most firms are run, I'd say most, by white people, senior management, white men probably, then you're not going to be that surprised to find. This is bearing in mind the ethnicity, the definition I gave earlier about what an ethnic pay gap was, and it relating to average earnings regardless of role or seniority. So you're looking at a tiny gap, 2.3%, regardless, without taking into account any variables that you might expect in the workplace. That's the measure in 2019 of the problem. Now, maybe since 2019, the death of George Floyd, people started becoming really unfair to black people. Maybe they did, I missed it. And so that's Michael says, I'm sorry it's legalistic, but it's key to understanding whether this act is worth a grain of salt, whether it's worthwhile all the trouble we're going to have putting it through and then acting on it, and the monitoring that's going to happen, the data, the figure we're going to have, that they must score points by showing they have got their pay gap down, and all the variables I mentioned before.
Thank you. Albie, do you want to go next?
Well, lots of very good questions. I'll come to Elliot's question about exploitation. I find it really irritating when people talk about capitalism being exploitative, like it's a one-way relationship between the business owner and the worker. The worker is being paid, and there should be, as there is a UK law, a baseline that all employers should provide in terms of employment standards, and then different employers have different benefits on top of it, and then the employees go to whichever employer offers the best benefits or the best pay. It's a two-way thing. So I don't think we need to ask the question whether or not we need exploitation or equality. There are laws that all employers have to follow, and then if employees meet certain criteria, they get hired by that employer, and then they go on in their career. I don't see employees being exploited by their employers in some professions any more than the employee exploiting their employers, if that makes sense. On the question about the lady that spoke about we shouldn't talk about race because it divides people, it's an argument that I hear a lot, but I think it's about how we talk about race. I do think actually we've got to talk about race. I think there's merit in having conversations like this, but I think there's got to be a diversity of thought and a diversity of opinion when it comes to talking about race, not just echo chambers, not one group of people talking about critical race theory and sort of left-wing ideologies and other people talking about we're all anti-identity politics. Those groups of people need to talk to each other to find solutions. So that's my point on that. On the point about whether or not the Equality Act has improved race relations, I don't know whether or not you can point to the Equality Act as to being the single thing that's improved race relations since 2010, but I do think race relations have improved since 2010. I don't know what the limiting factor is. I don't know if it's the Equality Act. I don't know if it's other things. I don't know if society has just naturally evolved. But I am one of these people that says race relations are better today than they were in the past. And if you look at a lot of the statistics, it's actually borne out in the average episode. Now, whether or not you can legislate for those improvements to happen, that's another question. But that's one of the reasons why I'm sceptical about the Race Equality Act itself. And maybe we need other ways to continue the improvement on race relations that we've seen in Britain since my grandfather came here in the late 1950s until his grandson is sitting here on a panel in London with a multicultural audience in 2024. He would never have imagined this would have been happening, but it is happening. Race relations have improved. It might not always feel that way, but they have.
Thank you, Albie. Say the other way, super. Other way, okay.
Really good questions, very thought-provoking. I am grappling with this a little bit, and I was grappling with it as I prepared for this session, that race has become, within the framework of identity politics, a sort of discussion about whether nice people are nice and nasty people are nasty, and what race has to do with the nastiness and what race has to do with the niceness. It's about attitudes to other people. That's how it's generally framed and how it's generally discussed. Am I hostile to you because of something called race? And obviously, as I said, we don't really know what that refers to. In the Equality Act, race is defined as colour and national origin and ethnicity and any matter of things. But the truth about race is not really, when it boils down to it, what we think about other people in our lives and how we judge them based on what we perceive to be their protected characteristics and race. The truth of race lies in the economic structure of our society. As I said, it's globalized labour market. And as I said, and this is why I sort of skimmed quickly through the Brexit debates, that we were told relentlessly, and I didn't say it's a pejorative term, but by those very people who want us now to accept that there cannot be ethnic pay disparities, those same people, largely aligned with the left, said we must have immigrants to do the low-paid jobs. They said it again and again and again. And the gentleman at the back made a reference to the fact that in his casual observations, he sees, when he walks about this city or wherever he lives, he sees ethnicity, broadly defined, aligned in some way with occupation. We see certain kinds of people doing certain kinds of jobs. East Europeans, Black Africans. We see some correlation between occupation and race. Now, if you look at the Equality Act, you will notice, if you go to the explanatory notes, that caste is not a protected characteristic. So skin colour and ethnic origin are protected. Caste, which is a term that is associated with South Asia and a very specific system of hierarchies that are racialized but primarily have to do with occupation. Your caste defines the kind of work we can do, and your caste defines the kind of work you're not allowed to do. Within this society, caste is not a protected characteristic. You cannot bring the discrimination claim on the basis of caste discrimination. I invite you to think about whether, in fact, the reality of Britain today is a series of caste-like structures where international labour from all over the world is geared over to do certain kinds of jobs. And that is completely excluded from the conversation on race. It's not even mentioned in the Equality Act, except to say caste is not a protected characteristic. And anyway, it's a sort of a regional term that belongs to a certain part of the world that's nothing to do with the UK anyway. That's the economic reality. So all of these conversations about, am I nice to this person because they're darker skinned than me, is superficial. It doesn't have anything to say about the reality of Britain today, which is that we have a caste-like system where we bring people in to do certain kinds of jobs based on their race. And I think we need to have a conversation about that. And the fact of the matter is the race equality proposals by Labour reflect nothing more than a civil service mindset or a public sector mindset. These people have never worked. They don't understand what I would call law of supply and demand rather than exploitation. They don't understand that money incentivizes and businesses operate accordingly. They don't want to have a conversation about open borders and how that's going to impact the existing structures that we have of labour, which is from where we get our original notion of class. They don't want to talk about that. They want to wallpaper over it with a fuzzy, feel-good utopian project called Let's All Be Nice and Equal. And in reality, it's bullshit. That's my
I think we get the feeling of the audience here. Well, I would like to say that if we have any people who disagree, please do say. You will not be handed down. We welcome people disagreement. It's the way we can make better arguments on all sides. But Hardeep, is there more you want to briefly come back? And then I'll come out again to more Bishuri points.
Just wanted to throw out a random fact that I found out recently, which puts it into context this whole conversation that loving or loathing, 1 in 200 men, including the men in this Kanuri True, are descendants of Genghis Khan, that's Zeus. So I can else put these into context. Now,
One of the things I think grievance culture came up on the back there. And I think one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is that actually politicians are responsible for exacerbating grievance culture when they are not seen or perceived to be treating crimes that are carried out by different groups equally and treating people on a level pegging field. So I think, I gave the example of BLM, and that was even just a perception from politicians that they're treating different groups differently, be it race, be it religion, be it any other protected characteristic. I think that is dangerous, and it had dangerous consequences to society. I totally agree with the gentleman that said the problem is class. In fact, and there's a new policy exchange study that's just come out, which I hadn't had the chance to read, by Dr. Rakib Ehsan, and the conclusions from the people that were surveyed in that study say the social class rather than race, but is considered by them to be a barrier to success in the UK. So that has the Equality Act improved race relations? That's a really profound question. I think we should sort of measure ourselves really by kind of the profound words of people like Rosa Parks, who on her 77th birthday said, "I would like to be known as a person who is concerned about freedom and equality and justice and prosperity of all people." And we need to keep that in mind when we're considering this whole debate, actually.
Thank you. I'm going to come out to the audience again. I have a lot of sympathy for the economic arguments that you're putting out, or basis for this classical materialist basis for racism. However, I do wonder if and this is just points you were saying, that we can't so easily dismiss the fact that it is also has an ideological reality, precisely because it does obfuscate the whole nexus of other important relationships, economic relationships between citizens within a country and across different nations as well, in a new global order where it is no longer kind of got the political and economic Howard Arms of the whole post-war period. There's an awful lot of big changes happening here. And so what function is race doing? And it does seem to me, we can't tell whether, race relations have improved. We can't tell whether it was the act itself that did it. It's very, we can then ask, well, what would the assumption be? If we think that our social relations are improved through an act of law, what does that tell us about how we see ourselves? Do we need law to make ourselves behave decently? Or can we assume that we're basically all right? Maybe we're not. Maybe we're all really horrible. And we need an inner police or a law to make us behave. Anyway, enough of me. Hands up, please, on this side.
Hi, thanks a lot to the panel. Prakash Shah here for Premier University of London. You've all adverted to this issue, but I just wanted to kind of just highlight it as a poking, which is that yes, we had kind of conceptual poverty in the language we have to describe the kind of problems that we are trying to touch on. That leads to a kind of poverty of thinking about these issues. So it's not just conceptual issue, but it's a problem of how we think about salient diversities in any particular society. But I wonder how you respond to those points. But the media I wanted to raise is also the question of taboos. What are we not allowed to say about the way in which, let's say, whatever racial diversity is a proxy for in society, what are we not able to say about it? Now, I work in an academic institution. I can tell you for certain that those places which are designed as research institutions are actually in the game of prohibiting discussions on certain issues, including research. So, if I just stick that. There's a point about caste discrimination is actionable, I'm pretty sure. There's cases which that effect. I'm sure you need to be able to find it on Nexus or Small. But it's not us. That is true, but it is actionable as part of ethnicity. I wrote a book on against the Equality Act provision of caste discrimination on the early act there, so did that in Britain, and so we can accept our decision on that.
Thank you very much. Of course, there are enormous implications for freedom of thought and speech in the discussion of race as well. Perhaps somebody might be covered.
Prior to the 1968 Race Relations Act, a certain Enoch Powell said that the legislation risked throwing a match onto gunpowder. Given the recent riots we've had, do those words now ring true again?
Just hopping back, I think Albie said, what is it, do you think, that causes the difference in academic performance between, say, for example, the black West Africans and the black Caribbeans? Is it something about culture, about how they're raised? And also, with another point, do you think that the reason why people from the ethnic minorities, how they're invited to the country to work with those skilled jobs, is that what causes this discrimination, this segregation, and this kind of conflict? Is that the main source of why there is such differences in ethnicity represented country?
I'd just like to refer to Albie saying that to improve the race relations, you would like to have an annual national forum. Personally, I would like us all to identify in our daily lives, when we see it, to shout out racism. And I think people are hiding behind the Equality Act. I am a health care worker at York District Hospital, a white healthcare worker, and this is my second vocation. I used to work as a corporate risk insurance underwriter for 34 years. And I wanted to prove that the white person can work as a healthcare worker in a missionary health service because I'm passionate about it. Our institutions, like the NHS, are working to segregate our society. They are providing training courses for black Asian and minority ethnic people only, saying that they need a safe space from white people. That definition of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people only has actually moved on. They are no longer using that. They are calling them the global majority. When the riots occurred, the leader of our hospital asked for, I don't know what to refer to them now, global majority stand, to attend a Zoom call and to show them support. If you need any security staff, if you're having any incidents, please let us know. We want to support you. Would it not have been better for all the staff to get together, for everybody to show that we are behind each other? Let us stop this segregation at our workplace, which is going into our society as well. If you see it, fight against it.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the panel again. We still have plenty of time, so please don't worry if you've not been taken yet. Now, Albie, you had a few directed directly to you, so I know you started last time, but let's start again this time.
So I'll start with the young lady at the front about the difference between outcomes for Black African and Black Caribbean communities. And look, I don't think anyone has the answers about it, but I don't think it's something which has been investigated. I think it's a question that we need to ask and speak about for in the Black community, but also more broadly in society, which is why I think forums like this are so important. Some people might not have even known that there were those differences in outcomes between Black African and Black Caribbean communities. Now, I think it's got something to do with family structure. We do know that the highest levels of family breakdown are in Black Caribbean communities. I think 63% of Black Caribbean families or Black Caribbean children grow up in a lone parent household. But then actually, Black African families, compared to the rest of the population, do actually see higher levels of family breakdown than other communities. Let's say the British Indian community, which I think is just 6% of British Indian children grow up in single parent households. So it's not just family structure, but I do think that is part of it. I also think there's something about the sorts of jobs and communities people from West Africa came to do in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the sorts of jobs and communities that people from the West Indies came to do in the 1950s and 1960s. I was speaking to my grandfather about this. He came over from the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. He came over here to study and then essentially ended up working in what you might call a corporate job. Whereas a lot of the Black Caribbean immigrants who came over from the West Indies were working in non-corporate jobs, builders, bus drivers, really anything they could get. So there was always this difference from the very beginning, from when Black people first came to the United, not first, but when they most recently came to the UK in the early to mid 20th century. So that might explain some of it, but I think it's an area that needs further investigation. Maybe other people know. I'd love to hear from you. In terms of the national forum versus speaking about racism whenever we see it, I don't think it's an either-or conversation. I think you should be able to call out racism when you see it and not feel scared to do so, at the same time as bring those experiences to forums like this, or rather more big, important forums like the one that I am proposing, where actually we can have this national conversation. A lot of times, I do a lot of broadcasting, people talk about, we need to have a national conversation on X, we need to have a national conversation on Y, and then it's like, well, what's the national conversation? No one's having it. We're having it on a BBC panel or on a GB News panel, that people aren't having it in the pub down the street, people aren't having it in their workplaces. It's not a national conversation, it's a conversation between chattering classes, and then we all feel good about it as we've had a conversation. We get lots of engagement on social media, but most people aren't sitting at home on their phones, watching people on television and then engaging on social media. I love the people that do, but it's a bit of an odd thing to do, isn't it? Let's be honest about it. So most people aren't engaging in these national conversations that we think we're having. So that's why I think it's so important to actually have a national forum to discuss these issues. On Enoch Powell, a gentleman from you mentioned Enoch Powell. I think we've really got to not hark back to Enoch Powell too much and look at him through rose-tinted glasses. You know, he made some pretty horrendous comments about pickaninnies and so on. I mean, even my former colleague Jacob Rees-Lowell at GB News really goes into just the awful things that Enoch Powell said at the time that were even at the time were completely outrageous. Things quite anti-Semitic as well. We shouldn't look at Enoch Powell through rose-tinted glasses. Now, does that mean that we can't have an honest conversation about what the merits are, the pros and cons of anti-discrimination legislation? Yes, we can, but not in the way that Enoch Powell did. And I think it's important for Conservatives to say, actually, a lot of stuff he was talking was total bollocks, and we should not be looking back at that with any sort of envy at all, thinking that he was right in any way, because I think he was wrong.
Thank you. That's a good point to end on, Albie. The only thing I would say about Enoch Powell, which is not really about anything he said, but I just would want to make the point that Enoch Powell's friend was Frank Field, a Labour politician. And that's not to say, so this is not a comment on their substantive ideas. It is a comment on a time when it was possible for people with vehemently differing ideas to have that conversation, which I think is what you were alluding to. So what you're arguing is not a pie in the sky. It has existed. We definitely seem to have lost it, and that's part what the battle of ideas hopes to contribute to. And it won't be everybody all at once. It will always be in different ways. But, you know, thank you for being here. Okay, I'm going to go to Hardeep.
Thank you. It's a comment by the lady there about what's going on in the workplace. Or sounds to me like segregation in the workplace and specific courses. Is it baying again? Is that horrendous word? Catch-all word. Now, and to the exclusion of white stock, which I think is really wrong the direction of travel here. And I think one of the things that we haven't touched on the truth there is actually the white working class boys are less likely to go into higher education. And we had some research at King's that looked at some of the reasons around this, and it wasn't all based on academic attainment, as I could have initially assumed. And there's also what the perception was in those communities around the value of education, and they didn't have the support they necessarily needed with applications and interviews. So it's kind of looking at, not neglecting any community, and I think this is the direction that was really worrying. On Enoch Powell, he it's quite personal one actually for me, because he opposed a campaign for Sikh bus conductors to wear their turbans on the buses, putting for what Anthony ended there. And he referred to that campaign as communalism. But Powell, he's often kind of hailed as he knew what's going to happen. Yeah, some people on the far right kind of often bring up the ghost of Powell. But I think tensions aren't simply just down to race. We've got religious tensions now in this country as well, and I think he didn't get it all right. He wasn't as bright as people say he was. And the good news for me is that his constituency now is occupied by Amanda Sikh heritage. So there's a bit of irony there, but he's probably his opposition to this campaign for the bus riders. I think I agree on family structure. I think to your point around variations, I think that probably equally applies to discrepancies between sort of elite communities and other South Asian communities as well. I think that I don't have the evidence or the research to present you with. I'd say family, the nuclear family and a supportive family with two parents is quite important for the prospects of children growing up.
Thank you, Hazi. Anna, is there anything you want to keep us on?
I can just say some general things about what's been said. I feel maybe we've lost a little bit of the door side of things, because race, and this is what annoys me about race, is, and what I said earlier, is we start to have conversations about ethnic tension, racial, social cohesion, and are people nice to each other, and it all becomes about attitudes, and are there bad attitudes out there that we have to kind of climb down on and encourage niceness. And, I just feel, okay, so if speaking from a legal perspective, right? To turn to your point about the ethnic racial segregation in your workplace, where this global majority category is invited to attend events from which somebody is not allowed to. I mean, we don't know. So but my question from a legal perspective is, how are you going to implement this properly? It's not enough. If you're going to talk about a legal framework for managing race, you can't just say ethnic minorities versus somebody else. You can't. You're going to have criteria by which you measure this stuff, which is why I made the joke about the vodka and tonic. And the lady in there identified my ethnicity. Well, actually, Shemi identified a bitter, because there's only a bitter bit that I can trade in this game. And that's the bit on my father's side. When it comes to my mother, we're talking something else. We're talking something else. Now, the darkness of my eyes is actually from my mother's Catholic background. The light skin that I have, I share with my father, who's an Ebenezer Muslim. So what I'm asking you to think about, and I'm not being facetious, I'm not trying to be provocative. How have societies in the past managed this problem? And you may not like what I'm going to say, but the answer has been blood quantum. You have to have a certain amount of blood, and you have to be able to prove that through paperwork, lineage, or some sort of personal witness in order to qualify for admission, whether it be to a Native American tribe or whether you can get married to certain people under the Nuremberg rules. And I'm not being silly. It really disturbs me that we are having to have conversations about who can go into which space. Now, one argument is that, well, we're rectifying the wrongs of history. Would you please explain to me where my Lebanese father has been wronged, hosted generously in this country as he has, and how my Irish Catholic mother hasn't been? It's a nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense, not to mention that Britain has very different relationships with different parts of the world, some historic, some recent. You cannot say that people who come here are somehow the victims of some historic transgression. And this goes back to the economics, and that's the non-legal conversation that we need to have. And I don't think law has the answer to this. If we have a global marketplace where we settle, people have to come here in order to do certain jobs that we won't do, whoever we are, then you cannot then turn around with some magical piece of paper, the Race Equality Act, and say, race disparities in income are bad. Because you've just invited people here on that very premise. So you need to have a conversation about the economics of things before you start wading magical paper. And to your question, which is a decent question actually, is why are we seeing these disparities along racial lines? Is because that is how the marketplace works. And to quote Tony Sewell, disparity doesn't necessarily mean discrimination. Of course it's not nice to be paid less, but plenty of people are paid less than other people. It's a big step, and it's a very big legal step. The threshold is very high to show, as you would have to in any discrimination claim under equality legislation currently, that some sort of detriment or some sort of treatment is because of your colour, or because of your race, or because of your religion. That threshold to demonstrate that the because of part of the test is very difficult. And that is why, although the world seems like it's full of people bringing racial discrimination claims in the tribunals and the courts of this country, actually, it's very hard to secure a victory because you have to show that this treatment that you received, including your pay, was because of the colour of your skin or the way that you speak. And of course there are implications. If you don't speak English, or you don't speak English well, you're probably not going to have a customer-facing role in a business. Whereas you might be put to work on a production line where you don't have to speak English. That's not racism. So those are my thoughts on that. I can't really elaborate. But I think what I've seen from this session today is that we have to be very careful when we're talking about racism in society, of race in society and cohesion, that we don't just substitute that conversation for questions about how we're going to legislate. The law can't really help us here. And to be very honest, I don't think most people need the law in order to coexist with other people in society. I really don't think we need that. And the idea that we need to be constantly told what is a transgression, what is discrimination, what is an offensive remark is just paving away for more and more state regulation and control. And that is my concern.
I'm going to ask Colin in a second, but what that point you just made there, Anna, it kind of a little bit relates to with your question. And also what Albie said, there hasn't been much research onto why there's this disparity between black Africans and black Caribbean students in education. And, my part of my background is as an educational researcher, and there has been a real problem in people looking at that because it has been assumed to be blame model, the research. So people who wanted to look at that in the past have actually been unable to. They've not got the funding, or they've been gently advised to take their research proposal in a different direction. And that is a problem. That is a problem that's addressing anything. The other thing, of course, is that there is a much bigger gap between, for example, kids and pupils being entered for the EBAC, the 5 GCSEs at grade 5, in English, maths, science, humanities and a language. There's it's actually black students who have a much higher rate being entered for it than white students. And there are geographical disparities there as well. But anyway, all these things are to be mulled over more. I'm going to take Colin. We will then have about 15 minutes for another round coming out to you. So put your hands down for the now, Colin, and then put your hands up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be brief because people want to make their constitution. But I look around this room, and to my shock, I feel I'm probably the oldest person here, which is rare. Different. Thank you. And so what I thought might be quite useful, given that we've had the term global majority used, is for me to share with you my experience of what I've been known as in this country since I first arrived here in 1969. And I've been a lot of things. And I started out as a Negro. I then became coloured. I then became black. I then became Afro-Caribbean, West Indian, black again, black and ethnic minority, black and minority ethnic, the one we all like. I then recently become a POC, a POC, which stands for person of colours. Now, Colin, that posits that there is such a thing as a person without colour, which is a nonsense again. White people and person of colour. Then there's also a BIPOC. I've been called the BIPOC, which includes black indigenous, which of course is an American term, and more recently, global majority. Now, what all those things have in common is the one thing which, when I was growing up in the early years in the Caribbean, I knew I was, which was non-white. It's a way of saying non-white. So global majority means non-white people, which puts anybody in the world who is not adopting one of the whites who qualifies and so on into that pool. And of course, that's known now to be racist. You can't say non-whites. It's saying there are white people and the rest. So we need to find another term for it. And you have POC, BIPOC, you have global majority. Now, global majority is one which is very cunning because it allowed David Lammy, when ceding the Chagos Islands, to refer to the global majority, this mighty force of people, mighty. You look at the map, and of course, you look at the definition of global majority, and it excludes Israel, it excludes, I forget the country, I looked up and I had it tweeted about the other day, but it's all the countries which are south of the bridge they draw, who have economic power. So it's basically black and brown people. That's the global majority. Now, I don't know about you, some people may be happy using that type of euphemism. I hate it. Just talk about black, brown people, white people. It's much easier. We know what we're dealing with rather than having to work out for ourselves. What are they talking about? Who are they speaking about? It's the same with this act, and just return to it because we strayed off it a little bit, the Race Equality Act, to address difference in ethnic outcome. That's the key thing here. It's outcomes. I'm all about opportunity. Give somebody a chance. Let them make it what they will. Not what is the outcome. Let's make sure he or she gets paid as him or her because we want that to be the case. That is not fair. That's not equality doctrine. That is trying to fix it. Or as I called it when I was a schoolboy, we call that cooking it. It's trying to cook it for societal and for societal political reasons. And I'm against that thoroughly.
Thank you. It's very easy to say equality of opportunity. I say it myself. Do we mean by that just want to push a little bit on that? Would it be, for example, right for me to have the equal opportunity to apply for a job as a scientist when I absolutely failed my mathematics and have not got a clue about science? So that's a sort of extreme case, but obviously what I'm getting at is how does that fit with the idea of meritocracy, which is something you may want to think about. But right, now, we're on to our last 15 minutes, and now I am going to finish strictly in a quarter to.
So I just wanted to push back against the fourth speaker a little bit. I thought I sort of was a bit conflicted in terms of you mentioned socialism of being used as a way for the workers in terms of globalized market, right? I thought your mention of that, I mean, the underpinning of what Steve's mentioned was this whole idea of class. And you mentioned socialism sort of drove it when in the UK we obviously had a lot of socialist ideas in terms of NHS and welfare. And I think one of the reasons why we had our riots was, if you think about it, was because of stuff like austerity and sort of conservative policies that were pushed. And a lot of our racial relations and why there's so much hatred going on and vitriol is because people don't have jobs and social security nets. And we talked about white attainment in terms of boys. Well, if we don't have a formal education because we're going for austerity and spending cuts, etc., surely that's the problem we should be focused on. And I feel the sort of idea, the act that we brought up today is sort of hollow and it is already sort of been addressed. Or I do agree with you, it's already sort of been addressed with the Authorities Act. But I feel what we really need to focus on is this idea of austerity and the fact of force. And that I feel writing off socialism isn't exactly what it should be doing.
What I don't really understand about this new bill is what it adds to what we already have under the Equality Act. And in fact, I suspect it may detract from what we already have, in the sense that it's already perfectly possible to bring a complaint that you pay less than a one person, but perhaps it's for one person who's being less. The only reason why equal pay for sex, because of sex is a separate ratio to the normal sex discrimination, is just an historical anomaly, is equal pay and first before sex discrimination unit. And it's a nightmare. Equal pay days are a total nightmare. They're really, really difficult to agree, incredibly difficult to navigate, really with a lawyer, and very difficult to weigh. So why do we need to separate out ways? Wouldn't it be better to get the people who pay for sex way back in to sex discrimination? It seems to me strongly arguable that this is performative. This is for the sake of headlines say we're bringing in a right to equal pay or greater breasts, which we already have. We have as it's 1975 at least, 1976, and what's it called? I mean, I can see the ethnic pay gap reporting is an extra thing, but no problem through them.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick and brief. But, so I'm 18 next month, and I'm glad to say that I can't recall an incident where I've ever faced overt racism in my life. I might be an exception. My memory might be bad, but I think I do remember this. I want to ask, could it a reason for improvement since the Southall rights, for example, in race relations, be that today's generation, my generation, is more proud of our heritage and background? I find that many attempts of racism at me fall apart when I understand that my own cultural background, what it was, and appreciate it. As I see it, it's my culture, and every culture has good and bad aspects, but so does the majority white culture. And I agree that a national conversation may actually improve relations if we learn from one another's cultures. So you don't have to be nice to acknowledge another cultural point of view and have intercultural debates, and then agree and disagree over their views. I can give a short example of this. There was talk about the family units. Well, I'm proud of the way that, for example, Indian families have traditionally treated their grandparents elderly and not ostracize them from the family unit. And I think intercultural dialogue may improve the way that the elderly are treated in this country. They're sent to caregivers and essentially, removed from the society. So I think that historically, and there's been examples the other way as well, where the white majority culture has show, the Indian culture, where maybe their culture can improve as well. So I think intercultural debate, it's all about free speech from both sides. So that's my view.
So just bringing it back to the legal position, is the problem, Max, what's been trying to law, it's a law at group level rather than individual level? Is the problem the fact that we spend more and more time thinking about people in terms of groups rather than as individuals? So what's happening in this this new bill? So that's going even further. There's a view that progress was about people being treated as individuals rather than as groups, and in fact what's happening is going in the opposite direction.
I really agree with a lot of what Anna said, because you cannot really fight racism or sexism or anything through introducing rules. And I very much against this law and against the Equality Act 2010, because contrary to everything everyone said, how can you actually have a harmonious society if all these laws, especially this one and the last one, is viewing us through the prism of our skin color, our identity, not about who we are or do, our actions, but everything through my color of my skin versus the color of the skin someone sitting over there. All it does, and I know this from being at workplace, is, as example was shown there by the person in the NHS, it just creates more division and pitches us against each other. So I think rather than talking about which particular part of this act you really want, we should just say no. And Labour is just a cop-out, really. They've bottled it. They don't want to address what the problem is. So very easy, introduce a law and let us deal with the fallout.
First of all, just I think I mentioned Thomas Sowell. I think if more people read Thomas Sowell, the quality of this conversation will improve greatly, much more other than students of Harvard. My question is to all the Afghanists, and it goes to the basic premise that I think you all see to accept, which is, and I want to question it. So my question is, in a free society, should you not be free to discriminate on whatever basis you want to, whether it's race or gender or hair color? Is now a basic tenet of freedom that you should be free to discriminate.
So there's this question that's been floating around about whether race relations have improved since the Equality Act 2010. It was also proposed that there should be a referendum which would reportedly improve race relations. However, what evidence does the government have that race relations have not improved? What metrics do you believe the panelists should look at in order to analyze race relations? The problem is in the definition of relations. This does not just include how people groups behave toward each other, they also feel. So how on earth are we expected to analyze, critically dissect feelings?
I would really like to hear all the panelists say yes or no, should we be free to discriminate, as well as any other things. Panelists, in reverse order, if you could say a yay or nay to should we be free to discriminate, and then any other final points. Anna. Look, started it. Look.
There are some conversations to be had, which I think we are having. You may not have them on national television, but the fact of the matter is people do discriminate. And they discriminate for all sorts of reasons. I don't necessarily believe that discrimination is hate viewable. If I'm an Asian restaurant owner from Bangladesh, and my family are the people that work in my restaurant, and I live in a Bangladeshi area, there's all sorts of discrimination going on there, but is it hate-filled? Is it hate-fueled? Is it hate-driven? Similarly, an Irish plumber, a white plumber who likes to have English-speaking white guys to work with. I mean, there's preference, there's in-group preference, and we know this because when we look at immigration patterns, when people come and they settle and they create in-groups, they create in-group dynamics where they did. Where I live, for example, it's mainly a Turkish area. You're not Turkish. There are implications to not being Turkish, including maybe not having recourse to protection if there are antisocial elements in the street where I live. I can't ask the council or the police to deal with certain things, but I could, if I were Turkish, potentially ask somebody to help me out. So there are in-group dynamics, and with that comes preferences and decision-making. And we cannot track what is going on all of the time in relation to what is increasingly an expanding field of protected characteristics. Take disability. Very, very quickly, disability is a protected characteristic, and we think of disabled people as people who are impaired physically, maybe, but now there is the whole world of hidden disabilities, mental health issues. I've even seen examples where somebody who was able to classify not liking his job, I'm not kidding, as a disability, well, who amongst us can stand up and say that protected characteristic multiplies me? So the point is that we have an expanding empire of protected characteristics which are trying to track every element of human behaviour, not just in relation to race, but in relation to other things as well. And we know that gender is a quagmire. We haven't talked about that, thankfully, today. But what I would say is that we do have to have some honest conversations about the fact that people do organise themselves as their culture and language and religion and racial background matter. And if you're ready to ask lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people to come without restriction from all over the world, there's going to be an equilibrium problem in the society in certain pockets of the country. So it makes no sense, as I said before, to wave this magic wand of the law whilst having no regard for whatever for the economic and sociological, anthropological reality on the ground. So yes, I agree with you. By the way, we need a forum, an annual forum to discuss this, right? And thank you very much. So taking it back to yes, you do, you should do. You can't stop. You can't stop.
Stop. Next up, then Hardeep.
Of course, just technically, just on that, because we've literally got a minute.
I see the gentleman with bow tie and glasses a bit of a fire star. I think there's nothing that should stop us from having a free, open debate about our differences. I think we should be all encourage one another to have a healthy conversation about our differences and be curious about each other's lives and backgrounds and differences. But I think what I would say is that I think there's irrational and rational prejudice. So most of us in this room, I hope, wouldn't go along and stroke of iron. So I think we need to kind of differentiate between the two.
But thank you. I'm very sorry to be but
Next up.
We discriminate every day, all the time. When I walk out of the family, to walk past people who are smiling at me and speak to that person smiling at me, and I'm discriminating. The question is, to what extent do we impose limitations on our discrimination? I just want to say quickly about accurate point, spot on. It's entirely true. And your point as well, Chair, it is about making groups, and then the member of the group, you are a victim or you are an oppressor, and that's how it's supposed to work.
You three succeed, thank you. Albie, yours.
The free society, I would just always bring it back to the harm principle. Do no harm is my motto. There are harmful forms of discrimination. There are harmless forms of discrimination. I think individuals are probably best placed to decide whether or not they're being harmless or harmful. On the point about analysing and critiquing feelings that this young lady spoke about, I would say don't analyse and critique feelings, analyse and critique data. And we have lots of data that we can analyse and critique. Education and outcomes, if we look at the people that are in different positions of power, certain types of employment people are in, who is in the AB cohort. There's lots of data that we can look at to prove whether or not race relations have improved in this country. We don't need to be talking about people's feelings.
Great discussion. Thank you.